Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here. I'm Margarita with the Community Foundation, and I'm going to turn it over to Julie Portner.
Hi, I'm Julie from Crossroads United Way and Margarita from the Noble County Community Foundation and DECO Foundation, Sarah and Greg. We're really happy to introduce you to Matthew Sisk, who is the Director of Civic and Geospatial Analysis and Learning Laboratory from the Lucy Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and he's going to do a presentation for you on AI. Thank you very much.
Hi. Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Julie. Yeah, like was just said, my name is Matthew Sisk. I work in the Lucy Institute, which is sort of the AI data and society crossover everything place at Notre Dame. And why that leads me in a spot that I can give workshops like this is that we are meant to be data science and AI tools for the social good, which means that we're constantly trying to find ways to apply these things to real world tasks in a way that makes impact more than just in an academic publication or in somebody sort of getting a grant or something like that. So what I want to kind of go through today is just a little bit on sort of the basics of AI, of what we can do with these things, and kind of where we might be able to streamline your processes and streamline what you're doing to make the kind of the maximum impact. I want to start off with just a couple of quick caveats. I'm going to go into sort of how these tools work because I think it's really useful to do that, to sort of understand how they work, to understand what the limitations might be. But I am, for my sins, a college professor. So if I go too far into something and am so excited about it that it is just completely no one else's, feel free to derail me with whatever. So I'm completely okay being interrupted with questions. I'm completely okay being sort of to make things into a discussion. We don't have a huge group. I think it would be totally fine if we kind of chat about things at various points. I'm going to try to keep this as interactive as possible. We're going to do a few demos. We're going to have a couple of little breakout groups and do some things live so that we're not just listening to me talk for 90 minutes is probably not anyone's favorite thing to do. Okay. And the other kind of warning I wanted to give is that I am not an AI researcher. You can see from my title here that I work on like maps and spatial data and community impact things. I do a lot of AI related work, and I've been working in the space for a while. But I'm not going to try to explain to the level of like how these tools are created and how they're made and what the impacts of them there are. So I'm happy to answer those kinds of questions, but I'm trying to keep it as practical as possible. So what I want to kind of go through this morning is just sort of an overview of kind of the big picture things, what we can do, what these tools are, how they work. I think that this is pretty useful because AI tools are something that we've suddenly started seeing everywhere in all media. We've started seeing the fear of a lot of things, the impacts of a lot of things. But what we don't always see is an explanation of how they actually work. And kind of what that means for what they can do and what they can't do very effectively. There's also a whole series. I teach an entire full-length semester class basically just on the ethics of AI and then the ethics and the impacts and sort of AI-related justice things. I'm going to go into a little bit of that just because I would feel really guilty if I only talked about the really, really positive stuff. We're going to do a couple little case studies and talk about some practical applications. And then I do want to leave plenty of time for any questions and answers sort of as we go through everything this morning. The other thing I want to say is that please do feel free to unmute and ask questions and things. Because of the way that the Zoom is set up, I can't really see anybody, so I'm just sort of talking to an empty computer screen. So that's both a little alienating and weird if you haven't done it as much as I have, but also makes it hard for me to know if somebody's like really engaged or if they have a question or anything. So please do go ahead and do whatever you need to get my attention. So what I hope everyone will get away from here today is kind of these major goals here. An understanding of how these tools work, what they do, and how they do what they do. And a little bit of the sort of ecosystem of tools that are freely available that probably have the most impact for nonprofits and people working in sort of public services, particularly around how they can do things for you. And then I do really like I already kind of hit this a little bit, but I just want to stress again that having an understanding of the limits and biases I think is really, really important, because it isn't something to go into lightly, but it is something that can really make a big difference if you go into it with eyes open. So I want to just take a quick moment just to sort of level set for me and for everyone else, to just sort of understand a little about how familiar folks in the room or in the virtual room are with generative AI tools. This is fun. I get to answer too, so I'm gonna put mine on. Okay, so it looks like all right. I'm gonna guess that I was probably one of very few people that put very, and that's totally fine. Which means that we're sort of overwhelmingly on a little, which is great. That's exactly where I kind of want us to be. It actually makes me pretty happy that people at least know what generative AI means, or at least have heard the words before, and a little bit of familiarity is awesome. So, in the sense also of kind of let's make this a little bit awkward so that we all start talking here first thing in the morning on a Thursday. I also want to just pause for a minute and just have a little bit of a chat around what comes to your mind when you hear AI. We talked about familiarity with stuff, and this is where I really want to kind of get a sense of like how people feel about it.
Hi, this is Ginger,
Mhm.
and my experience has primarily been with Chat GPT.
Okay. So ChatGPT would be the one word you think of when you think AI.
Yes.
Okay.
I would echo that. This is Karina with the Milford Collective. I just discovered that it can help me write news releases, and it saved me so much time.
Yeah, we'll be doing some of that later on. It really does make a difference on those kinds of things. So yeah, we've got some things in the chat too. We've got a certain amount of uncertainty, confusion, generation, artificial, as in like it needs to be revised. Resource, that's a really good one to sort of look at because it is a tool. Evolving, yeah, social media. These are great. Yeah, yeah. So this we're sort of split between really practical things, like really things that people can do with it, or the names of tools, and then a little bit of this idea of like the potential, but also the fear, which I think mostly mirrors how society looks at these sorts of things. So this is great. I'm really, really happy that folks are kind of coming at it from the point that I thought we would be coming at it from. Tools that people have mentioned, we'll get back around to some of these things. ChatGPT is a big one. I'm going to demo mostly in ChatGPT, a little bit in Gemini, probably. Gemini is Google's version of ChatGPT. There's Claude is another one that you'll see around a lot. Canva, the sort of like layout software, has a bunch of AI tools, but I don't remember. I don't demo those because I think they're not in the free tier, and I don't have a subscription, and I don't assume that everyone would. But there's lots of these. Same thing with Adobe. There's these things exist in most of the big software packages at this point. So cool. Okay. So we have a certain amount of a little familiarity. We have a certain amount of certain tools. We have a certain amount of hope and also apprehension around using these things. And I think that largely kind of mirrors where we're at elsewhere. So these are just a couple of images that have been put out there. These are probably, I believe these are both AI generated images about AI. So sort of kind of what you see when you think about these things is this idea of kind of robots doing our thinking for us, or in some way talking to a human, or communing in some way. I'm not quite sure what that's meant to indicate on the bottom right there. But this idea that it is, robotic, it is a little sterile, but it's meant to sort of be human in some way. And if you remember, I'm sure I'm one of the older folks in the room, but the old like the movie AI, the way that these things were viewed in like Terminator and stuff like that was all very, very like different than what we're seeing today. We don't really see a situation where we have a physical thing that is the AI. We see, that we have software that's kind of handling these things for us, mostly in an online environment. And to get to kind of where that is and why that is, that's basically what these things are. So AI as a field has actually been around for a long time and has had a lot of breakthroughs over that time, but has really kind of become something that's in the public sense within the last like 3 years or so. And these AI systems are essentially anything we're doing with software or machines that's meant to mimic the way a human thinks, or to mimic the output of how a human thinks or reasons or does problem solving. So instead of having very cold logic of one thing to another, it's meant to mimic the idea that there might be connections in there, or that we might be able to do something that sounds like natural language instead of just being kind of pumped out information in a really sterile way. There's a couple of different sort of subfields that are in here. I'm not going to talk about these in much detail, but the main ones that we would think about if we were really looking at artificial intelligence as an academic discipline are things like machine learning, where we're letting the software basically make the connections between things instead of saying you will look for this versus that. Natural language processing is how this is how Siri works. This is how Alexa works. This is how all of these things that can kind of process human speech, but then process the language and the text and actually understand what it's about instead of just how the words are structured. And then this idea of robotics as well. I am not a roboticist at all. I don't really know much about this other than it's the same sorts of tools that drive how the robots move and interact with things. However, when we say artificial intelligence in 2025, what we really mean is generative AI. And these are tools that are sort of based on a lot of these other academic discipline parts of artificial intelligence, but are tools that are designed, models that are created to generate something based off of some sort of prompt that we give it. So we tell it, we want this thing, and it returns back to us something that it has created from that thing. These are all of these kind of like tools that we talked about before. ChatGPT, Copilot is Microsoft's version of it. Gemini, Claude, DALL-E is one that's specifically meant to create images. It's mostly been incorporated into ChatGPT at this point. And in fact, that's what's down on the bottom right or bottom left there is when I took over a class at one point. The previous professor had been like a very accomplished photographer, and I am not at all. It was a class on AI ethics. So I used AI to regenerate all of his pictures and just gave it a prompt that was like, hey, make something exactly like this and make it as realistic as possible. And then at the end of the class, that was the ethical conversation was like, hey, I completely ripped off somebody else's things and had AI recreate them. Is that ethical? So that's what that one is down on the left there is a DALL-E generated image of a dark primeval forest. And how these things work mostly is we say something like this. This is one I gave it to it relatively recently. Make me a picture of a cat riding on a flying toaster like it is a swashbuckling movie poster from the early 20th century. I am not a graphic designer. It would have been impossible for me to build this thing at all. So what I did is I just asked the computer to do it. I asked the software to do it, and it was able to parse the information that's in there well enough to create an image for me. I really, really like this one a lot. However, I left it in for two reasons also. One is it is not as intelligent as you think it is. Cats don't generally have 5 legs. They usually only have 4, is my experience. And if they did have an extra one with a hand with a sword, it probably wouldn't be sticking out of their neck. And then I'm not quite sure what this is meant to be because it's not angled right to be off the back of the toaster. So it works in some ways, in other ways it doesn't. There's a whole process you can do with these prompts where you're sort of regenerating it over and over again. So How these things work, though, is where the kind of interesting part is. They're sort of presented as if it is sitting there understanding exactly what I've asked for and then generating something off of it. So that prompt that I have right there, make me a picture, understanding that and then interpreting that in some way to create the image or to create the text that I give it back. And it kind of is like that, but it's not quite the same as the way that a human brain would do it. So this image again is not what I would have thought of necessarily in my head. Certainly not with the number of legs on the cat, but generally as well, it's not exactly what I meant, but it still is a pretty good interpretation of it. So what happens with these things is that they're powered by what's called a large language model. GPT is the large language model in ChatGPT. So that's where the GPT comes from. And what they do is they train these things on huge amounts of text, all sorts of stuff, whatever they can get their hands on. And because of that, the model is huge. It's a giant piece of code out there. And it lets it sort of use all of that stuff to connect into what the next thing should be. So it can do that to kind of predict what the next word in a sentence or the next word in or the next part of an image would be based off of all of the other stuff that it's seen before. This is why these companies like OpenAI that makes ChatGPT have revenue in the billions, spend in the billions, and still aren't making a huge amount of money. Is because this is a massive amount of information that has to be processed to create these things. And what ends up happening is that they're not always perfect. When I get to ethics in a little bit and things like that, I'll talk about why. But effectively, we had a moment a few years ago where we as society, we as technology, needed a core, like a amount of information that would help us create this next generation large language model, the GPT run. We could have chosen all of the published literature of the entire world. We could have chosen a very heavily curated list of all of the really good stuff that humans have produced. Instead, we chose the internet largely. So that creeps into how these things talk sometimes. It creeps into some of the information that's available in them. It's getting better as more things are kind of filtered and the retrained things are getting a little bit less biased, but it's still in there as well. So again, large language models. This is the part where it's dangerous for me to talk about this stuff because I start geeking out. We have trained on huge amounts of information. Training a new GPT model takes about 5% of the annual energy output of the state of California, just to train one model. That only happens once every few months or so. It's not like that's every day. And then it uses that to kind of predict the next word in a sentence. So again, this is a little bit just about the sort of training process. We're doing this thing where it pulls in the language structure, it pulls in relationships between words. It's really unlikely. There's this like linguistics thing where the order that we have adjectives in English is pretty pretty concise or pretty standardized. So I wouldn't ever. So if I was talking about a big gray cat, I would probably not ever say the gray big cat. I would probably almost say the big gray cat. It's not a rule, but it's just it's just culturally how we speak in English more often than not. So if it's looked at a billion words, it probably has seen that enough times that it knows that we would always do it that way, and it's not going to make a mistake to put it in the wrong way, even though it's grammatically correct too. So when we do this, it kind of gives us this idea that we can fine tune it. This is how, if it sees 1,000 grant reports or grant proposals, it knows how to talk in that type of voice based off of everything else that it's seen before. So you can imagine that's why it takes a huge amount of computational power. It takes a huge amount of time. It takes a huge amount of data to train these things. But once they're in place, it's just sort of querying into there of how you would talk if you were talking about a grant report or an impact assessment or something like that. And in practice, when we do this thing, when we go to say ChatGPT or any of the other ones, we say to it, "Hey, write me a grant proposal for youth education," and it's gonna give you a coherent response because it has all of this information before it that it can use to kind of string it all together. And this contextual understanding from the prompt about it's a grant proposal means it's only going to look at the things that are kind of like grant proposals when it does it. So it does end up in a situation where you rarely end up if you say, hey, write me a formal thing. It's probably not going to give you something that sounds like slang or vice versa, which is actually a pretty cool breakthrough that they were able to sort of train these things that way. So functionally, how this works, if it's going to write a sentence and we're talking about the weather, and it starts off with the sky is, it's looking back at that giant corpus of information it has, that subset based off of whether we're talking formally or grant proposals or whatever. And it has a list of words that could follow that. The sky is blue, the sky is clear, the sky is usually, the sky is and then would be followed by something else. So every word, it then has, for the next word, it has a probability of what would be in there next. In the case of this, the sky is, after sky, there's about 100% chance that that has to be is, unless it's of, like the sky of the sky of Montana is big or something. So there's very, very few choices that could happen after that. But when we get into here, if we're talking positively about the weather, it's probably going to be one of these things. And those are sort of ranked off of likelihood. And this is where it gets a little bit, there's a little bit of randomness in there, is it's not always going to choose the most common next word, the most common next concept that comes in. So in this case, the most likely is the sky is blue. But it could, just by random rolling of a dice every time it does this, end up with the sky is clear. Maybe the sky is clear and blue. So it's just stringing things together one after another. And some of that can be, we've already seen this a little bit even pre-ChatGPT, pre-AI. When you go to type things into like Google, it auto completes or it guesses at what you might want to be saying based off all of the searches that have come before, and then these are the most common ones. So in this case, this is one of my students put this together, and she's just obsessed with capybaras. So she was saying like, I saw a capybara, and then it's sort of like these are the most likely choices that could come after it. However, because of that, it's generating this information off of a list of possibilities that was trained and brought into it at a certain point. So it's not always 100% up to date, and it's not always 100% accurate when it comes to facts. Because there might be a certain number of cases where somebody has written something or where it's trying to assume something that is just actually not true. So this was written pre-election, but we wrote in a prompt that today is 2028, who's the president of the US in 2026, and it was saying basically that Biden was the president. We did it again, it could have been the exact inverse. It could have been the other way. It just happened to be that this is what came through, but it's presenting this as if it's information, when in fact it's sort of this random stringing together of words that is most likely. Okay, so that's basically how these things work, is they're stringing together information. They're random in some ways, but they're actually, the randomness is meant to be a little bit lower. The randomness of it can actually be, we'll talk about hallucinations and things like that in a little bit here. But that can be part of that, where it can connect dots that don't actually connect. And that can be a really problematic thing if you're trying to use generative AI for information retrieval as opposed to information generation. So just something to be a little bit thinking about when you're kind of building out next.
So pretty sure it was just a flapper for
Okay, that was just a mic issue. That wasn't a question. Got it. Yeah. So at this point, I just want to pause for a minute, since I've now talked about how large language models are created, how generative AI works a little bit. I didn't really talk about the image generation part, but you can think about it the same way, as it's putting pieces into an image based off of what you said and a certain tone by looking at a billion other images beforehand. Okay, so why don't we take just a minute here? And now that we've gone through the basics of what these things are, Why don't we talk briefly about kind of concerns or opportunities that you see for using these tools in your organization? I'd sort of set this up to do it in breakout rooms because I thought we were going to have a slightly larger number of people. With only 20 or so, we could just do this in the main room and just sort of unmute and talk about things. I would be completely okay with that. Does anyone have a preference on small groups, large groups?
Large groups is fine.
Okay. That's, a vote of one takes it. So does anyone have thoughts about opportunities, challenges, worries?
I'll unmute. Well, I guess I wasn't thinking thoughts, opportunities, challenges. I was thinking specifically how we've used it a little bit in the last year, and I've come a long way in the last year. So I'm Corinne Markwell. I'm head of school at Southwest Montessori Academy in Fort Wayne, and so one of the things I used it for last year was we had a fundraiser. We have an annual fundraiser gala, and we always have a theme, and we wanted to get creative on the sponsorship levels. We wanted it to tie into the theme. So it was like, okay, our theme last year was planting seeds for growth, So, okay, suggest sponsorship levels that tie into this theme. And it popped up and it was like, wow, that was fun. That was really impressive. And so it was fun to be able to try to order those, in our own mind as to which would be the highest level. And so that was really helpful. And then one of the things that we've been doing, trying out this year is, we write student progress reports. And, historically, I've been told I'm a little bit more eloquent in my writing, much more so than my spoken word, but that, it's always been easy for me to come up with a narrative for a student based on their individual gifts, gains, and goals. And so now we're kind of playing around with my past written examples of students and my past, gifts, gains, and goals that we've written for them, and then see how does it actually come out, and could we use it, to help speed up teachers' efforts in writing those narratives about the student, as long as it contains that unique information about the child. It's the wording and the way it flows, and so we're kind of trying that out. So those are some ways that we've used it in our organization.
Yeah, there's some those are really good. I do that a lot too with like if I just so Valentine's Day was recent and the data science program wanted to send out a bunch of like really corny like data science Valentines. So like I hit my limit of creativity on like math puns like real quick. But if something that's looked at a billion other sources of math puns was really good at finding another 15 or so for us to send out. So similar sorts of things. Like the creativity it's not creative in the same sense, but it can find some of these things that the connection you might not put together. Yeah. And I would, when we talk about privacy concerns and things like that, I think that'll be really an interesting conversation around education stuff also, because there are some guardrails on there that exist in some tools but not in others, and it may be a point to sort of think through kind of how that gets functions or how that functions. Yeah.
I work with a group, and we survey them after each of their sessions. And so we're starting to use ChatGPT to summarize. So rather than just, 25 to 50 bullet points of feedback, using it to summarize that. A lot of meetings, we've been using the notes. I use it a lot with, I'm wanting to, in addition to my own voice, how can I bring some other voices, other phrasing, that type of thing? So whether it's for a newsletter article, a donor letter, social media captions, have been using it even as a thought generator.
Yeah, no, that's really good. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about using it to help it not all sound like the same person wrote it effectively. Like that's actually pretty clever. And that's, it's just not something that we do a lot in the academy because we all write exactly the same, like a bunch of geeks that can't do anything but passive voice. So it's really neat to see that there's these other applications. Yeah, thank you.
So just before this meeting, I put a message in the chat that popped up right before this meeting started. great, Google Workspace is going to come out with this AI. I honestly have no idea where to start with this. I've only used it one time
Yeah.
to help me because I was just overwriting grants. I had written 6 in a row and I was done with wording.
Hmm.
And so I just said, tell me this. Tell me what impact this has on this. And
Hmm.
it was great. It gave me some work, but I mean, this is great information, but for those of us who have no idea where to start,
Hmm.
where's the best place to start?
Yeah, so we'll do some demos in a little bit here. I think that's probably the best thing. Of all of the tools that are out there, I would say ChatGPT is probably the easiest to start with because it's now got images in it too, but it's mostly just text, you know. So it's kind of clear that you're just sort of having this weird conversation with a web browser, basically. Um, the Google ones are getting there. Also, the Gemini is the one right there. I mean, I wouldn't say that you'll probably start a lot with like Notebook LM. It's a little bit more code based generally. But Gemini is comparable. I like Gemini perhaps a little bit more in the sense that it will tell you more clearly when it can't do something. It's not just going to try. If it just can't do it, it's going to be like, yeah, no, I can't write your social media post for you. Um, Whereas ChatGPT will do it and just maybe not do the best job.
That's what I used. The one time I did this, I just went to Google and I said, hey, tell me tell me this impact. And I
Yeah.
was very surprised at what it came up with, but I just really haven't,
Mhm.
uh, for one thing, it's bandwidth. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a huge learning curve for me. So how much bandwidth do I have to put into another thing to try to learn? So I'm trying, so I'm here.
Yeah, no, this is great. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Matt, will you be talking about the security of which AI, tool to use? And, is it better to purchase the account rather than just put
Yeah.
your information in there?
Yeah, I'll talk about it a little bit when we get into the sort of ethics and data privacy things. I mean, the short answer on it is it changes pretty rapidly. And if there's anything that's privileged information, what is the old joke? Like if you can't tell what the product a company is selling is, it's you. And it's exactly the same with these things. So like they're using your information that you give them to retrain the next generation of models. So it's going back in there. So it's rare that you would ever want to put in like something that couldn't be made public, like you know, medical information is a classic example. Like there was a situation not too long ago where someone was putting in like patient records to get summaries, but that was just going into the thing. No one might ever actually see that, but it's still technically a violation of that stuff. Um, a lot of the newer ones, if you're paying them, um, they're often allowing it so that that doesn't happen. So like there was just a big agreement with the same level that the one with Gemini and Google that was in the chat came through with Notre Dame, where they're not where anything we send into it is not going back into their model because of like student records and FERPA and all those sorts of things. So just be a little careful with that kind of stuff. But I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail when we get into it. Yeah.
I definitely feel like the biggest like risk and opportunity with AI is time, because I often hear it billed as like it's going to save you time. But the times that I've used it, I feel like it has not necessarily saved me time because of the learning curve. And I'll put something in, it'll spit something out. I'm like, well, that's nice. But then I'll put it into an email or a grant and then I'll work on it. And then I end up changing like 90% of the words. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I
I
think
think that's the biggest risk and opportunity is, does it actually save time?
yeah, and I think that's a really good that's the learning curve I would say is figuring out what saves time and what doesn't. There are things that it is very good at. Simple computer code. If anyone ever runs into a situation where they have to do something where they have to write like a little script, so good at that because it's a very systematic way of writing that there is no deviation from it or it just won't work. So it's actually pretty good at like doing that. So if you have a data analyst and they need to do something, that can be a really good way to have them just do it quickly if they need to write, SQL or something. But if you're trying to write something very creative, you might end up rewriting it. If it's something that hasn't been done a whole lot, you might end up rewriting it. So it just kind of depends a little bit on those sorts of things. But like making something sound good, correcting the grammar, translation is actually pretty decent at translation because there's a lot of other language stuff out there. So cool. Okay, well that was good. It's really nice to hear where people are kind of coming from and where things are going. So let me just go back to my share screen here. So we hit on a couple of these when we were talking about stuff there, but I do just want to talk through some of like the kind of myths that are out there. That not always the case. These are changed, as like this is the whole AI realm is evolving so quickly that some of these may not be quite as relevant, even as when I first wrote this slide like a month ago. There is kind of this worry, I think, for a lot of folks that it's too expensive. Either you can't use the open source things, or because they're too expensive, or they're too if you're giving, you have to have the private like advanced tier. I think there's a lot of things you can do as long as you're careful with the free and kind of open things that are out there. There's a lot of I think view at least early on that this was something that required a lot of technology literacy and expertise. I really do think that as long as you're a little bit aware of how they work and what the limitations are, that it doesn't require much. My dad has decided it's really funny to send me a bunch of like AI generated images off of his phone. So I get random pictures of cats that I'm supposed to show to my daughter and things like that. So obviously, if my dad can do it, it's not requiring a lot of technology expertise. Maybe not so much in this realm, but in a lot of places, there's a lot of fear that AI tools are going to replace human workers. This is particularly strong right now in the kind of computer science where people are like, well, why would I learn how to code if I can just have, ChatGPT or Copilot write my code for me? And I think there's a lot of apprehension, maybe with writing as well, that this is going to take away jobs. I don't think anyone is going to lose a job to AI. It is entirely possible that people will lose a job to another person that knows how to use the AI tools effectively. And that's, I mean, more with coding than anything else. But I wouldn't say that there's from the inside a really huge fear that this is an entire like discipline, entire disciplines are just going to go away. If you think about it with like when spreadsheets in Excel became a really big thing, we didn't lose accountants. Like they're not accountants now, even though that's a much easier task than it used to be, because we don't have to do it on paper. They just changed what they do a little bit and sort of adapted that way. Librarians with Google, we didn't lose librarians. In fact, they have an even more important job now. It's just a little bit less about like the baseline finding of information. And then the sort of other ideas that these things it's just too complicated. Pulling it into a workflow for anything other than writing is just going to be a problem. But it's not really the case. There's lots of other things you can do, sort of like small things along the way that just might save a little bit of time and make it a little bit more efficient in an organization that might only have a couple of people, where the same person is doing both marketing and refilling the coffee pots and stuff like that. So. However, I do want to take a little time to just talk about some of these situations where we want to be careful. I mentioned this before, but most Gen AI tools, unless you are paying them for like a privacy tier, is going back into the model. If you give ChatGPT feedback, it's using that because it makes the next iteration that much better. If you give it financial information about an organization that shouldn't be made public, it's entirely possible that will be part of what someone else could get back out of it in the future. You definitely don't want to give it individualized health records or anything like that, unless you have this sort of tier where it's not going to be going back out there. And that's something that there's an agreement in place and lawyers have been involved and stuff like that. So I do want to just make sure everyone is aware that your prompts, your choices, the things you're entering in are in a lot of ways the product that is being monetized on a lot of these things. Similarly, these can be really good at gathering information and summarizing information, but they really shouldn't be used to make decisions, especially for like eligibility, for medical advice, for hiring. This has happened a lot. In fact, one of the first cases of sort of ethics in AI was about 5 or 6 years ago. Amazon was using an AI-based algorithm to look at all of the like software developers they had, and then choose based off of who they had, who they should hire for new roles. And it almost immediately started hiring only men because most of the developers were currently men, and only keywords that came out in a certain type of like college that they'd gone to. Um, that's not what you want to be doing. You would obviously want to be looking at everybody's applications equally, regardless of gender or sex or whatever. So having these things make decisions, whether you're eligible for a particular service, whether it's, whether you're going to a particular place, is not something that we really necessarily want to be using these tools on because of both that kind of randomness that's part of them, but then also because there are weird cases and it tends to reinforce biases if you do things this way. So just want to make sure that's clear. Probably not the case that in this sort of like basic level stuff that we would be using this to like hand it a case, like type a case into ChatGPT and say, should we give them this service or not? But just make sure that you're aware of that. We usually want to have a human doing that sort of thing. Not that we don't have our own weird biases and terrible things, but we're slightly less feel slightly more guilty about it if we're called out on it, I think. There's also a fair amount of stuff that it's just if you have a very unique voice or a very unique story you're trying to tell about your organization, it's not going to know that super well. It can help, just like what we were talking about before with generating cool ideas for donor levels. It can do a lot of that sort of stuff. But if it's really like a nuanced, deep, heartfelt story, probably not something that the AI is going to be able to replicate particularly authentically, and probably not something that it will do that great of a job with. Again, certain things are going to be great. Certain things are not going to be great. Contracts, these things that require someone that is an actual expert in them, probably not the best idea. I mean, I've used it before to like start the process of agreements and things like that, but I always want to have somebody that's a real professional look at it. Always want to have someone that really knows these things. But you just can't guarantee that it's going to be exactly what you need, and said in the right way because of the sort of complexity, but also the rigor and the lack of randomness that should happen in some of these documents. So similarly to that, the tools are getting a little bit better at this point, but specific facts are not always the best coming out of large language model based AI tools. And the reason for this is a couple of there's a few reasons why. First of all, most of the models themselves are trained on things that are not today or yesterday or even a few weeks ago. They're trained on things that are sort of in the deep past. Deep past in an internet sense, like 3-4 years ago. So they're not going to necessarily guess the next thing off of the most current information. And also, they don't tend to work really well with numbers because numbers don't function the same way as sentences do. So if you say, what is the population of Elkhart County? A basic large language model is not going to be able to do that very well because there's no reason that county would be followed by any particular number. The companies that make these things are aware of that, and they've started doing a little bit more kind of information retrieval in there as well. You might not see that that's what's happening, but I used to do this as sort of a funny exercise in ChatGPT, and it'll now actually like look at the Census Bureau if you ask about things like population. So it's actually looking at the source for it instead of the actual thing. Now, another thing that I want to just make sure that everyone is aware of is there is no information that is not biased in some way. There is no data that isn't biased in some way. So all of the biases that we as a humanity have are incorporated into all of these tools. You can try to remove it as much as you want, but there's always going to be some left. And the bias that's available in these things can actually still lead to some discriminatory stuff. So a couple examples of this. Early versions of ChatGPT had a tendency to not be able to rank what the information coming in very well was. So sometimes you would get things that were, it's trained on the internet, mostly on the internet, were like content on the internet, inflammatory, flat out wrong in some cases, satire, all these sorts of things. So they had to physically go through and find, have people tag what was misinformation within the data sets. So because of that, it's better now, but there's other things that are still available and still happen in there. And sort of the classic example, I meant to do some of these things earlier and I didn't. I'm just going to jump into ChatGPT real quick. Sort of a classic example of this is if I go into ChatGPT and I say, are there racial differences in skin thickness? The answer to this is no, they're not. There were thought to be for a really, really long time. It was kind of medical racism, people of darker skin not feeling as much pain, all of these other kinds of things that were part of sort of like how we viewed stuff for a long time. And because there's so much literature out there in the past that says this, it still comes up as this is true. And there are a certain number, I mean, I think something like 50% of doctors still believe that this is the case. But the medical literature suggests very strongly that it's not the case. So the biases that were in the thing that it was trained on are still there. So this is just going to happen with a lot of these things. So this is why you wouldn't want to use it for making decisions about individual people, because you can run into these kinds of problems. So biased data are within there. Somebody put in the chat that this sounds a little like Wikipedia, and that's exactly the case. However, the data that comes into it is curated in some way. So you're much less likely to run into a point where someone is going to where you're going to run into a situation where somebody ends up maliciously changing the information that's in there. Okay. I already talked about privacy stuff as well. Just make sure that you know there are privacy laws. We're not in California, so GDPR doesn't directly apply to us, and who knows what the regulatory landscape is going to look like in the next few years throughout the entirety of the U.S. So sometimes these things can really run into some data privacy issues. Another thing that we run into, maybe less with writing than we do with other things, is that we don't know often where the information comes from. Because the model is so complex, it can't actually point back at a source. There are some ways to do that, and there are some new tools that can do that. They can actually point to the source of a piece of information. But because of this opacity, this complexity, this randomness that's in how the AI tools work, we're not always going to know why on a decision. Just like we don't always know why on a human brain, why a decision was made. I don't know why I ate that third hot dog yesterday. I didn't really need it. I wasn't really hungry, but it happened. That kind of thing. So we just want to make sure that if you're using these things for any sort of decision-making tasks, which should probably not the best idea to in a lot of ways, that we can explain why, that we can go back and really kind of understand what the rationality behind there was. Another thing that you probably maybe have heard around these things is this concept of hallucinations. This is a silly kind of fun word that gets used for when a generative AI system produces false, misleading, or nonsensical information that appears plausible but is not based on real data. They happen for really strong reasons because they're based like it looks at patterns, it looks at what the next word should be, not based on factual accuracy. I was having trouble getting it to like getting anything to pop up really well to show this trait before. I used to have an example where I asked it like I think I asked ChatGPT like what is the coolest catfish in the world, and it started talking to me about sharks, which are not catfish. So it was like just misunderstood and it gave me the wrong information. Um, Hallucinations is kind of what we call them. I don't really like using that word because it implies that it's thinking, and it's not thinking. It implies that there's like a brain behind there. I usually just call it being wrong, like it's just wrong. But this is the word that kind of gets used in the media and things like that. But again, because it's based off of these statistical probabilities, it's not fact checking. There are ways to modify the model so that it does do fact checking and verifies accuracy, but that's really hard and doesn't work all that well on like a massive ChatGPT level scale. I have one that I work on that's is doing this for a bunch of information related to the peace process in the country of Colombia, and we're able to, because it's a small constrained thing, make sure that it doesn't hallucinate, that it doesn't give wrong information, because it's a constrained amount of information. So how do we get around some of this stuff? I think the fundamental thing to do is this idea of having a human in the loop. That we really shouldn't be using these tools with just as automation, even if it's more efficient for a lot of stuff. That we really want to have that kind of personal connection and have a person involved in some way, deciding whether it's doing a good job or not, or just simply deciding whether or not what we're pulling together is efficient for the work that we're trying to do. So this kind of balance between automation and interaction, I think, is really, really pretty crucial. And we call this human in the loop, sort of in the academic discipline of AI research. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that you can do with these things. These are sort of like the first one here is something you could do with a more complicated AI tool, just sort of connecting individual applicants with particular jobs. It's not something that you're going to do with generative AI necessarily. But the second one here where we're sort of translating things, I'll show this when I do some of the other kind of working examples in a minute here. When you're translating material, this really is something you can do with these tools. You just want to have it checked by a native speaker probably as well, because it will make mistakes in those settings also. So how can we do, what can we do with these things? We've already talked about these in some sense, because people have given examples, really cool examples throughout. But this can be a good way to like begin the early drafting of a proposal. I often, I don't know if I should say this on a recording, when I'm writing my grant proposals for big academic things, like I will often give it some keywords and some like bullet points and say, hey, write this into, a half a page of text, and then I'll just edit that instead of starting from scratch. I just mentally find it much easier to start with something than to start with a blank screen. I wouldn't say for research assistants, I would necessarily use generative AI to retrieve new information all the time. I wouldn't necessarily say like, hey, give me a summary report of all of the demographics of my county, and tell me what neighborhoods would be best to do outreach to, because it just isn't going to have enough information to do that. But what I might do is if I have a really long, 10-page report, I might ask it to summarize and give me the key information out of there that's relevant to the thing. Editing, grammaring, that kind of stuff. This is all great uses. Just paste in the text that you wrote and say, make the sound, make sure this is clear, make sure the grammar is correct. It does a pretty good job with that. And then we talked about sort of brainstorming ideas and that kind of thing. And I'll go through some of these when I pull up ChatGPT again here in a minute and kind of start in on some of the demo things. But I do want to just make sure that you you all are aware, if you are just starting out with these tools, that this is not like Google. Google and search engines tend to reward you for being succinct and direct in what you want. ChatGPT, generative AI more generally, actually rewards you for giving more information in the prompt that you're giving with. So if you're asking for a grant report or grant writer, if you're asking it to write the intro section of a grant, um, if you give it something like you are a grant writer in a nonprofit organization, please write me a grant proposal for, a program to deliver free lunches to school children on weekends or something like that. It'll do a better job of writing that if it knows to constrain it to a nonprofit grant writer. So it'll try to match the tone of what it sees elsewhere in there. So that can be a really powerful way to do that, is to sort of create these prompts that give you a better outcome at the end. So the tools that I talked about before, mentioned these a few times. Gemini, again, is this Google one. ChatGPT is the one that's probably the most commonly used at this point. Claude is another one that works pretty well. I actually like Claude a little bit for writing. It does a pretty good job with things. And then Copilot is just the Microsoft version of all of these things. They're all very similar in sort of how they feel now, but they have some different capabilities. Okay, so actually, before I do that, I'm just going to I think I had a slide that had demo on it, and then I just lost it. So I'm going to come back over into ChatGPT. And what I wanted to do was just sort of demo one of these things as well. So if I want to, let's say I wanted to create a, sorry, I'm just looking at a note on the other monitor. If I wanted to do like a donor outreach email, and I just didn't want to spend the time actually writing this thing, it's actually not too hard to do this in here. So if I was going to say, let's do write a outreach email to thank. Hang on, sorry, it just occurred to me that I probably have it so that people can't read very well. To thank donor. Yes. Here we go. So I've just write an outreach email to thank donors who contributed to our latest fundraising campaign for Crossroads United Way in Northern Indiana. And it comes back with actually a pretty good, pretty good overview of things that we would just copy in and then replace, the name. Can't thank you enough for your generosity and support. All sorts of things in here that give us a little bit more detail. All the other kinds of things that we put in there as well. It's then, it's trying to pretend it's chatting with us, or it is chatting with us, I suppose. Warm, appreciative, and emphasizes impact while inviting further engagement. You can say, sorry, I tend to be really conversational with this thing, but highlights are aiming to support the local industry as well. There, local industry jobs as well. So we're just sort of refining it, kind of building out just a little bit at a time to end up with something that's a little bit more targeted, and not necessarily something that you have to go do all of the thinking through of how to structure it. So I haven't done this exact one before, but I kind of like how it's pulled in this, sort of future-looking thing, stronger future. Really does kind of read like something that might be useful to have. other things that we could do with these kinds of things. Uh, we could, you could compare between different tools if you wanted to. We could see what this looked like in Copilot or one of the others, but they usually tend to end up being pretty much the same. I suppose I would just sort of ask at this point, since I would imagine that other people on the call write more of these kinds of emails and outreach things than I do. How does this sound? Does this sound like something that would be okay to use? Does this sound like something that needs a lot of tweaking?
This is something that I would tweak a little bit. Uh, several things that we send out. We want the donor to be the hero of the story, and so I've actually asked ChatGPT to rewrite it, making the reader or the donor first, or the focus of the story. So instead of like, dear donor, we can't thank you enough for your generosity. My preference would be starting with your generosity and support of Crossroads United Way. So I've asked for different tweaks like that.
Yeah. And it seems like when I do that, just asking the donor to be a little bit more central, it actually does a fairly good job.
Yeah, it
Of
does
such a
right
matter.
there.
Yeah.
Because of you, lives are changing.
Yeah. Sorry, if you just saw that it popped up, it hit a limit. There's different GPT models that it uses, and you get a certain number for free of like the really high end one. And I just hit my limit. So presumably it'll get worse now, but on something like this, it's probably not going to get much worse. Does anyone else have any thoughts on using it for this kind of task?
Can I just add in real quick? I know that, not everybody necessarily knows this, but some people do, that if it's too fluffy, you can even use words like tone it down or make it,
Yeah.
more common language. You can kind of give those little prompts to help it sound a little less,
Yeah.
super.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you can go anywhere with it as well. Like, so, I just asked it to make it sound like JFK. So it's like ripping off things from various JFK speeches, and also kind of, sounding a little like that in that tone of voice. Um, so, you can ask it to change the tone quite a bit, and it's got a big enough sample within there that it can do a lot of this sort of stuff. It's not going to do everything perfect. I mean, a classic example, if you want to be real silly, um, you can make it sound like Yoda, and things like that. But honestly, I mean, I'm being a little silly with it, but you could have it be less intense, more intense. You can kind of control a little bit of that. You might reach a point where it's easier to just go copy this into your email program and like write it, like change some of the words yourself. But in this moment, just sort of as a fun thing, you can do it pretty easily. Okay. So other things that you can do within most of the tools, maybe I'll just switch over to Gemini just to show another one. The embarrassing thing is Gemini is going to probably come up with like all of the things that I've asked it to do over time, which is sort of funny. So this is just the Google version. Mine may look slightly different because I have this Notre Dame account that's got some extra things, but I think it should be pretty common as well. Because I did want to just show like some of the other things we could do would be like I'm not zoomed in the same way again. Yeah. So I'm taking create an image for a social media post on the annual celebration for a regional non profit showing a diverse group eating dinner with warm lighting and the people. And it'll actually do it. It takes it a little bit longer to create images than it does other things. And sometimes these are really good, sometimes they're really not. But it can, it can save quite a bit of time if you're just creating something. And in most cases, these things are, so this one you might have to check. Some of them are like completely rights free because they've trained them on open source things or open access things. Some are not. So you just want to make sure you're a little bit careful with that kind of thing. I would say unless you're profiting off of it, it's probably a non-issue. But just know that sometimes there are some active lawsuits outside of the U.S. mostly around like if they've used a bunch of published books and didn't pay the authors and then are making money off of the facts that they used those books. What does that mean legally? This is not something we've ever had to deal with before. So just keep that in mind that these are a possibility. Image generation on a lot of the free tools, you're only going to get a few a day, but that they can still be a quick way to create something. In fact, I did one, like you could actually just do like other things that work are that into a flyer, which I can never remember which way to spell it. These things are also really good about spelling. Like they'll autocorrect your bad spelling. So we end up with hopefully eventually something that'll have that come through. I've done this before, like not in a work context, but when I've been like having a party at my house or something, and I just want to have a quick thing to send around to people. Yeah. So I don't know what
Matt,
sloop happen means, but yeah.
there's a question on how you check on the images. Like some people know how to check them on Google Images that they're okay to use. How do you check it on these platforms that they're okay to use?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to double check real quick which ones are definitely always okay and which ones are not, because they've changed the things a little bit. Is that's something that I'll look into it when we're done, and I'll send around an email that just says like what the current state of it is. It's just been a little while since I've taught my like ethics and rights class on AI, so I just don't remember what the standard is.
Thank you.
It should be okay because you're not going to get sued for it. Google would get sued for it, or Apple would get sued for it, or Microsoft would get sued for it because you're not using someone else's image. You're using an image generated by someone that used an image to make the image generator. So the image generator is the party that has caused the problem. But let me just look into it one more time and I'll send it around. Any other questions or anything on image gen stuff?
I don't see any.
Okay. I just hit the wrong one. Back down here. Tools. So yeah, the last kind of section that I wanted to do here, which shockingly we're like actually on time with, is I wanted to just have everyone kind of work on one of these together, like in small groups, so that you could experiment around with, doing one of the things that we've just done or creating something different, just using one of these tools, maybe one you haven't used before. And then we would come back and sort of share this out as a group to just sort of understand, did it work well for certain things? What needed a lot of tweaking? What wouldn't need a lot of tweaking? And I figured, I gave some examples of the scenarios here, but presumably y'all have something that you're working on that would be useful to maybe experiment around a little bit with. So does that sound good? Yeah, sounds like it'd be fun. I hope so. All right. This one might be good to just do breakout rooms on,
Okay.
just so that people can talk without having to talk over everyone. I don't have the ability to do that.
I'm doing that now. Do you want me to
Perfect.
put 3 people in
Yeah,
each
why don't we put 3
room or
people in each one? That way, if
Okay.
because I'll get stuck in one. Um,
All righty,
yeah.
here we go. How many minutes do you want them to be in there?
Let's do 8 minutes,
Okay,
and then we can do a quick share out and any Q&A at the end as well. Discussion.
okay. And you want them to work on something, anything on one of those platforms, correct?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have the ones in the slide. Was I not sharing? I must not have been sharing my screen when I said that, was I? Probably not. There's a there's a prompt right here that I can just paste this into the chat real quick as well. Okay.
Does everybody want to grab that real quick before I shoot you into a breakout? All right, here we go.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Sorry, I joined a group and was actively participating, and then of course did the thing where I was like talking like as it cut out. So I'm just gonna finish my sentence, which was because we had 2 people doing 2 examples, we had one single chat. These programs, most of the like ChatGPT, Gemini, most of them are set up like it's a one conversation. So if you ask it to do one thing and then immediately ask it to do something really different, sometimes it'll reference the first thing because it thinks it's continuation. So what you can do to get around that is just start a new chat. It's usually off to the left someplace, whether it's ChatGPT. All right. So I think at this point I wanted to just take a little time and if people could kind of report out what they did and what was useful, what required a lot of changes, what was better, anything you learned. And I will put someone on the spot, but my assumption is that someone will volunteer. So
Well, I'll share. Peyton talked about kind of her Facebook posts and how she uses Chat BT, whatever, for that. PT. GPT was really good. And I talked a little bit about I applied for a humanities grant, and unfortunately, their funding is being compromised. So I'm probably going to have to go out and look for some more sponsorship money. So while we were talking, kind of put together a Facebook post and then also a sponsorship letter, hoping maybe to go out and get more money for that. So,
and you did those actually in one of the programs?
and Chat GPT.
Yeah, generalized pre-trained if it's helpful to know the acronym. So it's probably not, but all right. Anybody else? So did anyone actually do something that was like directly what they needed to be doing today and save some time?
Well,
I did.
go ahead.
You can go ahead, Angie.
We have a new car repair network, and so we played with an image for a car care clinic, and it came up with some really interesting things. We told it to update it. We had a lot of spelling errors in the first one. So I guess what we learned is when you're generating an image, you really need to be very, very careful at looking at everything that's there, like spelling on things, where it's located. But we were able to say, ooh, make that more modern looking, and it changed it, then less industrial, and we went back to like a hospital kind of model. So it was a car care clinic. So I think if nothing else, for me, it's okay to experiment. It's not going to bite you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Someplace I can't find it. I was I was testing things earlier to see if I could come up with some good examples, and I had one where someone's head was on backwards in the picture, because it's connecting things like that. It's not actually necessarily putting the person as the object. It could be putting the person's head and then their body as separate objects. So it can be like just yeah. There's lots of like classic examples of like people with six fingers on their hands in these AI generated images and things. So be a little careful with those perhaps, but as long as you're proofreading, hopefully you'll catch some of them. Anyone else? We had a bunch of groups start and then kind of get overwhelmed there. So the group I was in, we did some captions for Facebook posts, which it actually Gemini gave a really good overview of like options as well. So if you asked it for that, it could give you like 3 or 4 different options depending on if you wanted it to be super serious versus super like informal. Refining was pretty easy, and pulling things together that way was pretty easy. Yeah. Anyone else want to sit in uncomfortable silence because this isn't a college class where I get to do that just for fun. Okay. Yeah, so we have about 8 minutes left. I did want to do one more just little quick poll as towards the end about kind of how we feel about Gen AI now after the beginning, sort of a little bit of an assessment there. But until then, I mean, we've done this sort of organically throughout, but I wanted to leave some space at the end if folks had additional questions, things to talk about. I do want to say that I just went ahead and like looked at the copyright stuff as well. And I'd say I would not actually be particularly worried because there's a relatively recent ruling in the US that like no AI generated stuff is copyrightable. So it's not going to ever be anything that comes down on you. It would come down on the company. In fact, as soon as you create those things, they're considered public domain because a computer can't own a copyright. So just keep that in mind as well. Uh, any other topics to discuss, conversations, questions? Yeah.
I have a question about custom GPTs.
Mhm.
So I've done like a little bit of training on how to create those, but I've been stuck on how to train it to like use my organization's content or things like that, like creating a little GPT that can be an email assistant or a grant writing assistant. Do you have
Yeah.
like tips for how much information to give it or what kind of information?
Yeah. Unduplicated was assuming things are not duplicated more is usually better on those things. So I mentioned a little bit before that we have a custom one that we run that's off of the archives from the Colombian like civil conflict and reconciliation process, and that's how that is done. Is it's mostly prompt engineering, so you have a really long prompt that you're feeding into it that says like do not find anything that's not within these data sources. Do not do this. Do not do that. And use this to like generate a response that's based off of truth and then reference things where you need to. So I think the prompt is actually like a couple of pages long that she uses on that. And it's just every time you search, it generates your search query within that prompt. That's probably the biggest thing. I have not generated one for creating like varied content off of it. This is much more of an information retrieval thing, but my suspicion is it's still pretty similar, is that as long as you give it a certain number of emails, it can generate an email that sounds like it's in your voice. Um, uh, yeah, I think that's probably kind of how I would generally go about that.
I thought you mentioned, and I maybe misheard, that you can use AI for different tasks or processes. Is
Um,
that just like generating, what those steps would be?
yeah, so there are processes that can be automated using these tools. So predicting cases of things can be a pretty powerful one. So I'm just going to go for an example from my work where we had a project at one point that was looking at households throughout the county, late utility payments, changes in taxes, like property taxes, and changes in rent, to sort of try to get ahead of like eviction and foreclosure, and get like resources to those individual households beforehand. And that was something that was complex enough, like that like just a regular statistical model wasn't working all that well. But to feed that into like sort of a process, an AI-based process model, which isn't generative AI, it's a slightly different part of everything.
Okay.
And then use that to actually generate the things that come out afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would say it's an advanced topic usually, other than like what is the process I would use to do this? And that's, I mean, I do that regularly. If I go and I'm like, well, I think I should use this process to do this task. Why don't I just ask the like ChatGPT what it says? And 9 times out of 10, I'm not wrong. But sometimes it comes up with a really cool idea. So
Okay. Thank you.
that is a really bad example of an AI generated image there. I like the guy with a foot hand. That's pretty good. So. All right. Well, hopefully this was useful for everyone. When I'm asked to give like a 90-minute thing, I'm always like, there's no possible human way I could fill 90 minutes. And then I remember that like occupational hazard of college professor is that I can fill any time with talking. And hopefully it was useful for everyone to see sort of how these tools work, what you can do with them, maybe play around with them a little bit for the first time or a different one for the first time. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I would say my email address should be all over everything. If anyone has
Yeah.
questions, anything, we are the Lucy Institute, we're community facing, despite being at Notre Dame. So we're completely happy to collaborate with folks on grant proposals, on really anything. And it doesn't even have to be that extreme. So just feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Yes. Thank you, Matt. And for everyone else, the next workshop will be financial planning for grants, creating clear and compelling budgets. It'll be April 24th from 9 to 10:30 via Zoom. So you should if you're not signed up for that, you should sign up for that. And I believe that our speaker will be Mike Ott for that. And we expect to see everybody there. So it'll be a good time with Mike Ott. And you will get the recording for this in an email along with a survey. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you learned a lot from today.